Hello, I'm Nick Kanoth. Welcome to the Como Vanguard podcast. This is the companion show to the Como Vanguard written publication available on Substack. You can find more information and past reporting as well as links to submit questions to this podcast and support the show at comovanguard.com.
I'm David Lyle, and on these podcasts, we're going to take a closer look at Columbia City Council meetings and the decisions that shape our community.
To help us do that, for our inaugural show for the first one of 2026 and really the first one ever, we are joined by Mayor Barbara Buffaloe, who will serve as our guest co-host for this episode.
Mayor, it's good to see you.
Hey, David.
What we like to do is to have people who are our co-host maybe introduce themselves, although I'm not sure what kind of introduction you would like to give us about yourself.
Well, I'll just say hello to your audience. This is Barbara. I am a former city staffer, but now in my second term as mayor of Columbia. And with that, it brings kind of an interesting perspective to the job, because sometimes I know some of the backstory because I used to be in those department head meetings when we were talking about things. I will say I appreciate the opportunity to kind of like show behind the scenes of a council meeting and maybe some of the conversations that happened that may be nuances in either the Vanguard report or on from the minutes or even just like Missourian reporting maybe don't cover. And so hoping that, you don't have to ask me tough questions, but I'm open to that.
We're interested in what you have to say. I'm curious also, go ahead and tell people how long a mayor's term is.
In Columbia, a mayor's term is 3 years. And so also important to point out in Columbia, we are a council manager form of government. So the mayor is elected at large. So all 6 wards vote for the mayor. But the mayor is only one vote at a council meeting, and I don't have veto power. The agenda is really put together by the city manager who is running the day-to-day operations of the city.
How many people have you run into during into your second term as mayor who think you're paid nicely for this position?
So many people. Yeah. So fun fact, the mayor makes now it's closer to $10,000 a year, but that's before taxes, which I have to pay. So I make about $161 every 2 weeks. And council members make a little bit more around like $6,000, $7,000 a year, again, before taxes.
Do you remember when that was set? Because it seemed to me like oftentimes my impression was that city council people only got certain expenses covered, like maybe for a phone or for driving.
Yeah, so in the council budget, there are some things that cover like a phone or travel and training that they can request reimbursement for. In 2014, I believe, was when, and this was a charter change. So this came to the voters in about 2012 or sometime before then, and then it went to the voters. They voted upon it for it to then be enacted a few years later. So I think it was 2014 when it started.
I'm going to get us off the track, Nick, but forgive me for just a second. I was talking to the other 2 hosts here, and I have a Columbia Business Times from back in early April of 2010.
Can I tell everyone about David Lyle's hoarding? Is this the time in the podcast where we talk about David
good as
Lyle's
any
I've
other.
weeded
hoarding
out a whole lot of
tendencies?
stuff, but this was interesting because it was a business roundtable, and they had several former council people like Chris Yanku, Carl Cruz, Jim Lovelace, Marianne McCullum, Larry Schuster, Brian Ash, Matt Harline, and Rex Campbell, along with former Mayor Darwin Hyman.
Oh, wow.
And at the end of this article, what we were talking about came up, and that was whether these former council persons thought that council people should be paid or not. Brian Ash said no, that they should not get anything, but by volunteering, it's easier when somebody calls up and starts to criticize you for you to say, hey, what do you want me to do? I'm just a volunteer.
That is true.
And
Yeah.
Jim Lovelace, first of all, said he thought they should get paid more than $16,000 a year. And that was 15 years ago. Anyway, I'm so glad that this came up where I could refer to that article because it was kind of fun to think about that. Anyway, we're here to talk about city council.
Oh, I'd love to have a whole podcast on the subject of compensation and powers of city council, but that is not today, unfortunately. Mayor. I know you also probably have strong opinions on that.
I do. We can talk about that at a future podcast.
Yes, that'll be a special episode that only for those who are very interested in the subject.
Yeah.
Which is a small amount. But back to present day, right? City council last night, you guys had a I would say regular agenda, not too long, not too short, and some of the highlights from our reporting last night ranged from city's finances, short-term rentals, the city's divert program, which is relatively new and showing results. Is there any one of those where you'd love to just jump on one and start talking about it?
Yeah, I'd love so I think 2 things I'd like to talk about first. The divert program is a perfect one to start off with. But first, just to start when we talk about like kind of a regular agenda, we were done before ten p.m. I will point out that
Barely.
that's common with the first meetings of January in past councils. Sometimes there might be a controversial thing, and then the city would get totally dinged because they did it when everyone was out of town. So, they try. I think the city manager tries to be purposeful with what goes on in agenda when especially the University of Missouri's system is on break. So the divert program, the reason why I want to talk about this is actually something that came up during council comments during that part of the report. So the divert program was started in 2023, and this was really the brainchild of our municipal judge in partnership with our director of health and human services and the Columbia Police Department. And it was this idea of like, Judge Nose was seeing people coming through frequently through our community support docket that were having like at least 3 incidents where they were becoming across a police department, law enforcement, animal control officer, somebody. And Judge Nose is like, I'm seeing these people a lot. Like sometimes this is the familiar faces program you'll hear referred. And they really most likely and most of these people, they just needed help accessing the services that would help them get on a better path. So the idea came about how do we divert them away from the criminal justice institution. And so the referrals come through for the divert program through either the community support docket, so somebody's received a violation, whether it's trespass, drug paraphernalia, or something that goes to municipal court. And they get so many of those references. It's either through the municipal support docket, or it's from a police department. So a police officer is stopping somebody for maybe trespass and is like, rather than immediately give them a citation and send them to municipal court, what about if I connected them with case managers, somebody to help them get into services? In some of these, it's finding housing. Some of it's helping them get their driver's license because they need it to get a job. Sometimes it's finding the opportunities that they have for treating substance abuse or mental health crisis. And so they created this idea, and it's basically a network of people within the city of Columbia that are working to get people out. And I think we've served over 1,000 people in the last 2 years. They talk about how it's kind of like 86% engagement, and the engagement's referring to like they actually then did connect. It's not just we gave them a connection to a social services, but they've also then taken that initiative to work on it. And so it has the potential, and we are growing it. We just started it with a pilot program with just one person in 23. And now we have a case manager, or we have a supervisor, 2 case managers, and then also people that are kind of assigned within those different departments to work with them.
When you talk about the engagement percentage, I understand what you just said about that, but has it had results? I'm trying to think about those who, I mean, anybody who's listening, I'm one of those listening. I'm thinking of the people without shelter or without homes, and I'm wondering if it has had success.
Yeah, so I think I would encourage people to click through and go to the report, which has some of the testimonials. So you've got somebody who was experiencing homelessness. They were recently incarcerated. They didn't feel comfortable going to a room at the inn because they had anger issues. Well, they got connected through the Divert program and eventually found transitional housing for them to be in, and then also working on that and are now employed. And I think of so they are seeing success with that. They are seeing success with getting people not just into services, but onto a better path.
Let me ask you this. You mentioned the community support docket.
Mhm.
If I were a citizen who said someone's trespassing, or I see this person sleeping on such and such lawn or this yard, or I see this person where I'm concerned about where they are, and I call that in, does that get directed to the community support docket? Or I don't understand how things happen on the
No, that's a
support
good
docket.
question. And yeah, so the average citizen cannot direct anyone into the Divert program or the community support docket. That happens through our legal system. But the point of this is that they will let's say you call somebody and you call 311, right, to report that in. Most likely one of our homeless outreach team officers will be the one who goes out to that location. Could potentially be somebody with one of our other social service providers. Burl does some of our outreach in that capacity because they have their co-responding team. So they will then reach out, they will go to connect with that person. If that person receives an actual citation, that would usually happen if it's like multiple times that they've been trespassed at that same location, then they would go into the community support docket. That gets decided by the court administrator with the municipal court. But the police department that's responding to that has the potential to immediately report to connect that person with the divert program. It doesn't have to go through municipal court. I think it's something like 3 instances. Like they have the like what are the sort of what are the metrics that would then gauge that person to go into the system? And so I'm not really sure the difference between if it's animal control officers versus law enforcement versus that, but they have their metrics of which to connect them.
Is the divert program funded through a general budget allocation or
Yep, this is through our general fund. So majority, you have to remember, like, so of our like over what over $500,000 or $500 million budget, majority is utilities. Our about $186 million is our general fund budget. 60 to 70% of that is public safety. So I think it's interesting to point out, but the divert program is actually within Health and Human Services, which is a very smaller portion of our general fund budget. So very small dollars are going to this, but we do know, but it's harder for us to measure what didn't happen. And so, when people talk about the metrics of impact, we talk about, well, we didn't necessarily measure every time an officer didn't go out to that person who was not sleeping in that yard. But we do know that anytime we can reduce the number of calls to service that police department has to respond to people that are trespassing or doing these activities, that is just helping them do their work better.
There was a graph in that report, which we included in our reporting because I really loved it showed the growth of the program because just for people to comprehend the numbers, right? When they started, which this graph starts in the winter of 2023, there were 25 engaged referrals, right?
Right,
Folks that are working in the program to have a better outcome.
right.
And then we see, the most recent numbers being summer 2025, or even going back to spring 2025, you see 254.
Yeah.
I mean, that's 10x in terms of engagement. And that has to be, and clearly the proof's in the pudding of having an impact and breaking that cycle, especially in the homeless community that we've seen. And I think it's also reflected in another graph I saw, which was that the homeless population is actually less in the latest count than it was same time the previous year.
Yeah, if you look at that in our point in time, and like the Boone County Coalition on Homelessness also has kind of a tracking that they do monthly tracking reports on this. You're seeing more people having the potential to get into housing, get into services. I recently watched an interview that Mayor Lucas was doing in Kansas City, and he says, we get a lot of people who are complaining about like hey, get these people off the side of the street. Get these people, I don't want them sleeping on this sidewalk. And he's like, you have to understand we have to have some place for them to go. And so like I'm appreciative of the investment that the city is doing in not only creating more opportunities, like our investment in the Opportunity Campus that will open this year, our investment into transitional housing, like Love Columbia's transitional housing, but also having services that help connect people because you don't know what you don't know. And so really helping them connect to get in those services allow us then to be like, hey, it's not safe for you to be here. You need to move on, but here's where you can go rather than just, you can't be here. That's not helpful.
It's interesting, Nick. I'm listening to what you said because perception means so much to people. And the perception is that the homeless population is not declining, just as perception about crime statistics sometimes is wrong. So, I mean, it's tough. I think it's tough. It would be a tough sell to
It's
people to say the homeless population is declining.
Well, because it's more than it was, when I came here in the 90s for college. And so I think for us, when we talk about perception, so many times, so many people are remembering Columbia of when they first came here for college or whatever. But I think the other thing is on that is we also allow ourselves to either it's what we've physically seen or it's what we've read. And a lot of times people are getting their information from like social media, like the scanner apps. Like you see that, and then that might be giving a false interpretation of what the reality is. At the same time, for most people, perception is reality. And so that is what they see. And whatever we can do and whatever we can do to help communicate what we are doing is important. I'll point out the reason why I wanted to start with the divert report was because we're sitting there and Don Waterman, he's like, "Well, the city needs to do a really good job about talking about this. Like, tell more about this." And I was kind of like, "Don, that's kind of on us too. Like, all of us need to do a better job talking about this." Like, I'd responded to an email that I got for somebody who's like, "What are you doing about?" I was like, "Well, perfect timing that I got this email because we have this program and it was an opportunity to engage in a community member and give that information."
Well, and last night was actually a perfect example of this kind of dichotomy between progress being made, but people not necessarily feeling it, and that you had this divert program being presented in a report, the impact it's making, the progress it's making, right? It's not 100% hasn't solved the issue.
Right.
And then you also had there was a gentleman last night, I recall, commented uh, during public comment at the end, I believe he was saying how he'd like to have and I remember quoting him, panhandlers with dogs taken care of, right? So that gentleman sees this as an issue. He would like it addressed. Probably doesn't believe it's being addressed
Right.
either, right?
Right.
So you had that dichotomy in this council meeting
Right.
where you have a report showing the city's working on it, but the issue is always going to be for most of the efforts that the city makes is that progress is incremental, right? You can't do, as you say, the city of Columbia cannot do big, impactful things overnight most of the time. It's certainly not on issues as complicated as homelessness. And this program, I think, is symbolic of that.
Well, and I think that's a good example too, because people's expectations, like often council members' expectations, are like, "What are we need to do more. We need to solve this. We need to be going faster." And it shows that it takes time to put this implementation past. You mentioned 2023, one person, right? Now three, soon to be five people in the divert program. Like we're going to continue to see success with that, but it takes time because we also have to show that it's working. We'll often hear people talk about, when you're giving out social services funding, the idea of like welfare. Well, people are like, it's so complicated to understand how this is going. Well, it's complicated because people were not really trusting of how that money was being utilized, right? In order to receive social services funding, like you have to jump through so many hoops. You have to go through so many different boards and commissions to get approval for your application. And then you have to showcase all of your finances because we want to make sure that we're being honest and truthful with taxpayer dollars because I want to be able to show the metrics of what we're doing. And so I think it takes time to implement something. It's not just a quick fix.
Absolutely.
I wanna Can we move from divert?
We should. We should divert
So
from
was
it.
another one, Nick, short-term rentals and that situation last night. Let me You both looked at that from being there in the meeting. I wasn't in the meeting, but I read the, Como Vanguard report, and I've seen other reports on and let me explain what I thought was happening, and you can tell me where I'm wrong on this. So you've got a couple, they have a house, it's on McBain. They want to use it as a short-term rental until they retire and move into it full-time, correct?
Correct.
So that seems if they've gone through the hoops that the city has in place for short-term rentals, then it's a slam dunk. They get permission to do that. I think where the discussion got off track a bit was talking about affordability because if that's not a short-term rental house, how's it going to help affordability or a affordable housing issue in this community?
Yeah, so you're right. And actually Jackie did a really good job. Jackie Sample last night, she's one of the first comments after Valerie spoke talking about these two things. And Planning and Zoning Commission had the same discussion. And it's conflating the two things. We have rules about short-term rentals, and these are the metrics by which you qualify for the conditional use permit. And this couple qualifies. Then we have, on the other hand, this is in an area of town that we've really tried to invest in because it's walkable, it's close to a lot of facilities, needs for people who might have the needs for services in maybe low income households. So affordability for that is that idea of like where it's located and the investment we had. The other thing that kind of threw a wrench into this one is that it's a former Job Point house.
I was going to ask that, but that was 10 years ago. I think one of the councilmen, might have been Nick Foster, I'm not sure, pointed out it's gone through the cycle of 10 years. So
Exactly.
when it was built as probably an affordable, if that was an in term 10 years ago,
Right.
an affordable house. Well, it's gone through that process.
Yeah. And I think, I imagine that council probably would have. I don't know that you would have had the 6-1 vote you had last night, which 6 approvals, one denial of it. Um, if if a few things had not been in play. One, the couple was very responsive to the questions that were asked of them, to reaching out to neighbors about their intent to it, to their very clear ideal is to retire here. Now they don't live in Columbia. They have family in Columbia. One of them talked about their long-term health and how it's declining and how they want to eventually retire here. And so having an accessible home was important to them as well. If this had been probably an outside investor who was just doing it for tourism, I don't know that you would have had the 6-1 vote. Yes, it met all the criteria, but I think the fact that this was somebody that was looking to also be part of the neighborhood, part of the community, and we're looking for an affordable housing as well. I think that helped also the concentrate because we do worry about the reason why we have restrictions on short-term rent, the reason why we did regulations is that we are worried about having enough housing stock for people that need it. But we're not there yet because we don't have a cap on short-term rentals and we don't have a definition for, what would not qualify as a short-term rental if the housing price was affordable. I
This
did air quotes on a podcast.
But what you brought up, if it had been an outside person who had no plans to live in this and just wanted to use it as an income source, as a short-term rental, and they met all the criteria, how could you vote no on that?
It would be hard. It would be hard to do that one. I think my guess is that the only reason why that might would happen would be because like they probably wouldn't have done all of the community outreach because you can do like if it's in conflict with the neighborhood, if there's other ones nearby, like there's a certain things that you can say no to for that. But I think because this was a wants to move into the neighborhood, wants to be there, wants to be part of the community, they did that additional outreach that maybe an outside investor wouldn't do.
I'd sure throw a fit though if I were the not on or not in Columbia owner and I met all of the criteria. I'd throw a fit if you voted no on me.
I mean, and I think you would have a point to do that. I
And
think it's just the question is whether or not you would have done all the outreach that happened for those who are here.
Is the outreach required?
It's not, but it's in the criteria. Oh, you know what I mean? It's kind of in the application. What
Right.
have you done for the, so it's
Yeah.
part of like,
It's asked, right? It asks them,
yeah,
what engagement have you done?
yeah.
But in terms of standards that they have to meet for the conditional use permit, for the conditions,
It's true.
it's not one of them.
But it's an interesting thing because so right now we're able to kind of weigh that into the considerations with planning and zoning as well as council, and because we have the conditional use process. However, because we're in this conversation about, look, this is taking up so much time at planning and zoning that they can't get to other projects, other things that are priorities for us. What can we do that's administrative permission? And so then that's the question that council's having, and that's going to be a work session or a pre-council coming up in the next like few months, where we're going to talk about what things do we need to get clearer, stricter on what are our criteria for meeting this. Like when we talk about 300 feet, is it as the crow flies? Is it around the corner? Like, what are we saying when we say that? So that then staff has a clear direction for this meets it or this doesn't. And then it doesn't have to go through the long process.
Well, and I would just add simply as an observer, right? Someone who's spent
Who
who's
no longer has to sit on the dais.
who's spent too much time in a city council chamber for several years now, about a decade, that this subject has taken up so much oxygen in that room for almost a decade now
Yeah.
and continues to. And so I'm happy to hear, and I think regardless of one's opinion on short-term rentals or Airbnbs, that folks would be happy to hear that it's not a done issue. And clearly it's not because of how many votes you said it. Not only is it taking up time at planning and zoning commission meetings, I don't think there's been a month gone by in the past year plus where council hasn't had to vote on one.
We've had multiple ones coming off. So now majority though are on consent because they're kind of ironing out those questions at the planning and zoning meeting. So the majority of them are on consent. We've only had probably, I would say, a handful that have actually come on old business to council.
if the council has already established the criteria, it should not be the council to be deciding whether this is okay or not, in my opinion. It should be a department. The city's carrying out the council's desire on the short-term rental.
But it's interesting because the way that the criteria is written allows some subjectivity to it, which then makes it not clear criteria,
No, that's a
right?
shame. Then it needs
I
to be
agree.
written
And
better.
that's exactly. And I think that's where we're kind of coming from is like, look, before this comes back to us as like this would be an administrative rule, we need to figure out what do we actually mean by 300 feet? What do we actually mean by parking spaces? What qualifies, what doesn't?
You shouldn't, and planning and zoning shouldn't be spending so much time on this
Agreed.
if you can get to a point where you've established it, just like anything else, like roll cards or anything else that has gone through the process. Before we move on, let me ask you one more thing, because I thought some of the discussion as I read it was that the comment was made that there are a lot of short-term rental places in that vicinity that haven't gone through the process of being approved.
Well, and that was the thing, it says says licensed, right? So
Yeah.
it says, and there's no licensed ones. Well, but we know there's two behind them. Like, well, I'm sorry, they haven't submitted their application. Yes, we need to both enforce that, but I do not feel right denying this one because they're going through the process and
So
they're not operating illegally and then asking for forgiveness. No, they're trying to do it from the right way from the get go.
Certainly a large aspect of this that is not necessarily discussed or an aspect or can be an aspect of what council does on the dais, but certainly is an integral part of this within our community is that it's also a political issue, right? Council members, the mayor, have constituencies who feel strongly about whether or not they want a short-term rental in their neighborhood or on their street. Imagine, frankly, that is why Councilwoman Valerie Carroll last night was the only one to vote no because this was in her ward and she wanted to represent the interests of her people,
Right.
right? But that's also why everyone else voted yes, because perhaps it wasn't in their ward. And so just all that to say, politics are an aspect for certain.
you said they're not?
They are.
They
They
are.
are.
But every issue of any kind of controversy that's going to impact the lives of somebody in Colombia is a political issue.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it just is.
I mean, because it's local government, right? Local
Sure.
government. I'm gonna run it. Barbie and Ben were the two people talking against us. I'm gonna run into Barbie and Ben shortly. Like Barbie and I are friends. We're gonna see each other at Ragtag or
Yeah.
at Schnucks or something. But we're still. I think this is the thing, though, is that, and this is why I love local government. Like you can have differences on some of these conversations that you're having, but at the end of the day, still understand where the person's coming from and be able to grab a slice of pizza.
Do other cities, and I'll ask Nick's opinion on this and yours, Barbara, the mayor, Barbara Buffaloe, our co-host here. Is it Colombia that can't make a decision in quicker than a decade on certain things? Or, I mean, how can you talk these things to death and never even establish that you've finished the conversation 10 years later?
I'll go first just to give the mayor a moment to consider her response to that. But from my experience, as somebody who has traveled the country working in government and government relations, it is certainly more unique to Colombia than it is other municipalities. I think that's a very safe thing to say, including having spent time working around Missouri with cities and municipalities. I haven't seen almost anything else like the public input process, the deliberative process that the city of Columbia goes through for things large and small.
Yes. Um, I will say, like, yes, and I think the things that factor into that when I talk to other mayors of university towns, this you do kind of see a little bit more additional length to that because it's a lot more of a engaged, educated community that's paying attention to these things. I think it depends on the issue though. There's some things that we're able to do pretty fast, right? And you're like, how did that just happen that fast? But this one took forever. When it comes to issues around trash, every city has issues with trash. It takes forever for trash because that's the touching your front door, right? When it comes to issues, right now, a lot of cities are struggling with housing and the complications with that, especially the things that are outside of our control. The cost of land, cost of labor, cost of materials coming in with tariffs. Some of those things like that's kind of outside of our control, but we're trying to address. I will say, yeah, you talk to, are you going to have the city manager be a co-host sometime? That would be fun. He would probably say like, yeah, Columbia is the most unique city I've ever worked in.
Absolutely. And just to say on the record, DeCarlin did agree to come on the show.
There we
So
go.
we'll have him here sooner than later.
Okay, sounds good.
Where do we go now? I could ask more
Oh, I
questions
know.
about this because it seems to me like sometimes there might be a certain attitude of niceness, and that's not probably the right word, not wanting to take a position on something highly controversial because you are going to face the people who are unhappy, regardless of which side you take on an issue.
And one thing that I'm really proud of in the last 4 years of doing this is that and Nick Foster, who's my mayor pro tem, we often talk about this. Like we know we're going to have to make some hard decisions because we inherited a lot of things that had been like you could use the metaphor kicked down the road, right? Kick the can down the road. Decisions not made, but the problem didn't go away. And so short-term rentals, automated collection, we're going to be having the conversation about transmission lines. We've talked about water towers. These are
Utility
things,
rates.
utility rates, like these are things that past councils had not voted on and still talk about. those councilmen, they still talk about it to this day. But you know what? I inherited that problem and we made votes on it. And so we've done that. So I will say you do have some of us that are committed to getting those things done, but the I don't know, the historical knowledge is still very rich in our community. And so even new council members are getting the pressure.
Do you think there are some in this community that would say, just make a decision, even if I don't like the decision? I wish you wouldn't have drawn this out as long as it did
Yeah.
on some of those issues.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so I think that they think, I've elected people, take the hard stand, understand you're going to be receiving some
Yeah.
criticism for it, or maybe not. But even if I don't like it, decide.
I joke, David, that you're welcome to not have to ask people about roll carts at the next candidate forum, because it's probably a question that was on every candidate forum for a decade.
I know that for a fact
I
because I
know.
mean
You moderate all of it.
I know where I was on my 60th birthday, and that was at a whatever, I can't remember the council person, but I remember I was at one of those roll cart
Yeah.
ward forums, and that's over 10 years ago.
Exactly.
So
So I think there's that where it's just kind of like somebody once I'm one of my favorite comments I ever saw on a Reddit thread was, I don't care about anything else she's done. The fact that Barbara got us to just decide on roll carts, I want to have a statue to her downtown.
well, want to go through the same. We're going to get off subject here, so let's not go any further than this. But with recyclable carts, I mean, some of us are going to have some issues with that because we made room for the garbage roll cart, and we don't have room for a recycle
Your
roll
tiny
cart.
little garage, David. Back to last night.
So,
So about last night.
yeah. So speaking of resources, financial resources for the city of Columbia, last night during your work session, you all discussed the very beginning of ideas and iterations of the FY27 budget. And I'd say really the theme for last night was the city doesn't have a lot of money, or at least it doesn't have a good projection that it will bring in as much money as it would like.
So I will point out one thing to point out about last night's meeting is we didn't have any projections. We had no estimated revenue projections coming in. So this is all just our assumptions that this year will be similar to last year
Mhm.
in that revenues will continue to stay kind of like flat as opposed to the 1.5% growth that we had been experiencing for the last decade. So I say that to say probably, but we
Mhm.
didn't actually have that last night. So last night was kind of the preliminary discussion about fiscal year 27 budget so that staff can go into prepping that budget with council priorities in mind. Now, fiscal year 26 budget, our priorities were public safety, housing, and city employees. And so kind of the gist last night was like, yep, those are still our priorities going forward. That's kind of what we hear in the citizen survey. That's what we hear when we talk to our representative groups. And that's what we hear when we talk about the community, like housing in that example. One of the other ones that Don mentioned, Don Waterman, he was like, I feel like economic development needs to also be a priority because, he's like, as you're talking about our revenues, maybe not increasing at the same growth, how do we encourage additional economic development? And then I kind of weighed in on that too. And I said, especially since we're seeing cuts to federal and state funding, like those are things that we've really relied on for health and human services, public safety, and transportation. And so if those cuts in housing, and if those cuts continue, are we going to keep doing those programs? How are we going to keep those services going? And so that was really where we were setting it. I will point out under the city employees, that's really like, how do you keep doing cost of living increases for your city employees so that they continue doing the work? Vera Elwood, our second ward council member, brought up, she's like, right, but we can't keep using reserves for that. Now, reserves, I think it's important to point out, especially for a general fund, reserves usually were created because we had vacancies. A lot of our reserves funds for a good period of time were vacancies in the police department. And so, you budgeted for that. You didn't spend it because you didn't have a person in that spot. So it went into reserves. And so that's why council felt okay, kind of dipping into them for using that. The other thing that helped with this year with fiscal year 26 was that we got the Brightspeed settlement or CenturyTel settlement, whichever name you want to use at the time. We got word of that settlement over the summer. And so while they were working through the legal system on that, we were like, it would look really bad if we got a $14 million settlement and it's going into reserves and we're not going to give a cost of living raise to our employees. And so we want, while the city manager is figuring out, how can we find additional savings in city expenditures, but also potential additional revenues, let's continue this cost of living increase until that time.
I know last year, DeCarlin Seawood, city manager, instructed staff to, look for savings in terms of cutting down on travel, cutting down on, maybe services they use or what things of that variety, which I would say, pretty small things, but trying to add up to something
Yeah.
meaningful. And to my knowledge, if I'm remembering historically, the last time the city of Columbia really had to do a cut was during COVID under city manager Glasscock at the time. I think he did a 10%
Yeah.
across the board cut. With that being the exception, right? Pandemic, very different time, very unique time. I think that's the only time in the past decade that the city's done a true cut just across the board. 10%'s a lot.
Yeah,
And
because I was because historically, like, so even when I worked for the city, and it, like, I came in, it was shortly after the housing crisis. So I started in 2010, and even then, basically, it was not cuts, but no growth.
right.
Right, there was no increase except for that it was a time of ARA funding before ARPA was ARA. Um, Besides the expenditures from that federal stimulus that was coming in, there was no growth. So you listen to Chief Schluty talk right now about historical underinvestment or lack of growth in the police department. Basically, police chiefs were told they couldn't ask for additional officers. Like, don't even ask, because part of it was we don't have the money for it. But more of it was this was the time when, because of the way that our classification and compensation was, we were not paying people at a market rate. So no one was applying for the jobs anyway. And so they're like, don't even put additional officers on the budget, because that's just going to be money that goes into reserves. And so, it's kind of a, okay, well, hold on. Rather than fix the problem, we just kept kind of, kicking it down the road. Look at this.
Well, and I bring up that historical context because I think it's safe to say that no one currently in city leadership, whether it's on city council or in city management, right, DeCarlin and his team included, has really been around long enough to have experienced leading the city of Columbia through a potential downturn in revenue. And so I'm really curious to see, I don't hope it happens, I'm sure we all share that sentiment, but going into the beginning of this FY27 budget cycle, I'm very curious to see if council's feet are put to the fire and they have to cut something. That's a huge question. I don't have an answer to that. I imagine no council person has an answer to that or wants to necessarily answer that question yet, because
You
who
know,
knows what will happen. As you said, we don't even have projections yet. It's more of a feeling based on 2025
right.
and going into 2026.
Right. I think for part of it is when I look at our budget and I look at, like, kind of what comes across to us, and I see the city manager's conversations with department heads, like what he projected for their cuts to be. I think of it like this way: of I have some council members who will be like, well, no, 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 no. That's just such a small amount. Like, let's not cut, for instance, board and commission funding, right, for their travel and training. And I view it as kind of like you said earlier, every little thing adds up. And I think when we're talking about priorities, right? Priorities for me are the city employees that are doing the day-to-day work, right? Those are your officers, your firefighters, those are the ones taking the bills, right? Those are the ones doing the water, the sewer line relining, all of that work. Those are your priorities. Like, that's what you start there first, and then you see what you have left. And then you go through it from there, like, what projects do we know? So we're lucky that for some of this, the biggest impact is general fund, right?
Mhm.
Some of our other things like capital improvement, we've been saving up that money for years, right? Park sales tax, also saving up that money. So some of those projects can still happen because they are allowed to continue from year to year. It's more of the annual expenditures of the general fund that pay salaries and the benefits and things that keep going up every year, we know.
Unrelated to what you're talking about, if there's a fourth objective, which is economic development, how would that change from what's being done now to attract economic development to Columbia?
Yeah, and I don't. Don didn't provide any kind of details on it, and I think that would be the clarification for Paul Eisenstein, our new Regional Economic Development
Mm.
Incorporated president and executive director, to say. I think for me, one of the things that I hear a lot from the city manager is, what can we do to incentivize commercial development, commercial retail development. In the state of Missouri, I don't see any increases in property tax coming down anytime soon, considering we're having freezes and eliminations in some spot. We know that there's discussions around eliminating income tax or reducing some of those things. Even though sales tax is a regressive tax, as far as like for planning for the future, sales tax is still a big piece of this. And so, the city manager has tasked the economic development department with how do you find more opportunities for retail, for things for people to then go out and buy and spend. And so I could imagine that some things might be, what could we do to incentivize, especially like north of 70? What can we do to incentivize, big box stores being built, north on Range Line or some of those places that will get more opportunities, more walkability, but also just more economic development. Now, we do have a few levers in place in the toolbox for industrial development or large manufacturing and development, but not as much for some of those smaller scale ones. And
Hmm.
so it could be that.
One thing I track and look at in terms of what the city can do, what our community can do for economic development that I know is a big deal to Reddy and, Paul and his team is, do we have shovel-ready sites? And how many? And how many are in development so that they are shovel-ready, right?
Yeah.
And my understanding, and it's been a minute since I've been at a Ready meetings, and I know you're there much more regularly, is that we don't necessarily right now have a very strong position. We don't have a lot of shovel-ready sites,
No,
right?
no, no.
And so that's probably an area where, as an example, one that the city could hypothetically invest more in. I say invest, not necessarily financially, right? There's other things the city can do as well.
Well, we just had an example of this 2 meetings ago. The conversation around a potential industrial site on Route B. So the owner was wanting to rezone the property for part agriculture, part industrial. And so I viewed it as a yes and, right? The part along Paris, it had been traditionally agriculture. The part along Paris Road could be industrial, and then the part closer to the creek could remain agriculture and continue that family farm that is there. Unfortunately, similar to the short-term rental, the conversation got derailed because the person had mentioned the potential of a data center, and it was like,
Mhm.
we don't have the capacity for a data center, right? We don't have the capacity for that, but the zoning would make sense for a light industrial along Paris Road, which would then help that. So when you get to a point of like, what can council do? Try to encourage that sort of like both and developments where it's like trying to preserve things, have stipulations in place, but also allowing it. The other thing for economic development that we know we've seen in the last 2 years that I expect to continue to see is the investment in the airport. And the investment in the airport allows more opportunities for growth of people coming in, business development of maybe local firms stay here because then they have those remote workers coming in. And that sort of development also helps the university, which we know is one of our biggest economic drivers.
Wonder how you attract small. I understand what you're saying about shovel ready. Those would be large projects, but there are a lot of empty glass front buildings here if you're trying to attract small retail businesses. I don't know how you attract those though.
It's interesting when you look at sometimes like some downtowns that have been doing redevelopment, like what can the city do to offer sort of like offsetting the cost of leases or improvements to the site? I think one of the questions that I remember years ago, one of our one of the appraisals groups had done was kind of looking at like what is the cost to rent storefronts in downtown Columbia, but in other areas around Columbia. I know from speaking to downtown property managers, they're like, we would bring down the price on so many of our storefronts. The bigger issue that they have is that the people that want to move in want to have guaranteed parking. They want to have guaranteed, spots in the garage or pull up right in front of parking.
It's
And
a
I think
downtown, folks. I mean, every downtown is going to struggle with the same thing, and I'm frustrated by that.
Well, I think for me, I look at it as I know the district is working on trying to help demystify the idea of parking downtown. One of my favorite graphics that they have out there is showing where you park at Target versus where you park downtown.
I understand
You
your
know,
point.
and you park a lot
Measure the
farther
distance.
away, yeah, at
Exactly.
Target, but yet because it's because the site, because you can see the door where you're going, you think you're a lot closer.
Kind of another angle I have on the whole small business thing, to David's point, in terms of what the city could do there. I know one frequent complaint I've heard in the past, I have my own gripes with it as well that I won't bring up here, is getting a business license in the city of Columbia. I know continues to be an issue for small business owners, for entrepreneurs who are trying to, start something from scratch. I know Ready has resources to help folks with that. Not everybody knows Ready exists. Not everybody wants to go to Ready. That's one avenue. But just simplifying that process,
No, we
especially given that the city recently raised, I think it was last year before, the cost of business licenses.
they're also frozen. They're also frozen right now because we're doing the study on that.
I thought they were only frozen above a certain point.
It started so we basically froze the automatic increase because we're doing the cost of service on the business license. So one of the things that I appreciated in this conversation, I appreciate the Chamber of Commerce kind of bringing us together on this conversation, and I got to hear from the person from 3M who's like, I understand that I should pay a higher business license because of my potential demand on public services, right? Like if they have a fire, it's a big deal, right? They have a lot of traffic coming out. It's a big deal. Whereas like Poppy doesn't have as much of a demand because, it's just smaller foot traffic, most likely, from those of us who frequent there and just ride our bikes everywhere. One of the conversations, though, that we have had is like they have tried to streamline it, at least from the business license perspective. Like online business license now are way easier to do. They will coach you through, walk you through it. But I think you point out a good thing that we have so many resources available to help people, like the entrepreneurship program at Ready, that will help walk through. But it's just letting people know about that. And it kind of takes us full circle, like to the Divert program. There's so much going on in the City of Columbia organization that it's hard for everyone to know. And they just make a lot of assumptions that we're not doing.
I want to make a jump cut, but if you have something else
I
you
was
need
gonna
to
say
say on
the
that.
same thing. Hard pivot.
I was going to ask for a hard pivot. I never thought a podcast that would last an hour would go this fast, but I want to talk about public safety before we run out of time. And especially, I know it's one of the focuses of the city again this year. You met with the governor on Monday. That has to do with public safety. I'm just curious as to what the atmosphere was like. What was it like when you walked into the governor's office and you got started on this conversation?
Well, greetings with smiles and handshakes and comments about the weather and the holidays. I think this is a good time to point out, sometimes people are making assumptions on, especially on social media, and narratives are written without the people that are involved in it holding the pen. And it gets frustrating at times because it allows then that story to go off on the tangents. And you mentioned, this year has been a public safety has been a focus. Public safety has been a focus of
Every
municipal
year.
government every year. That's why it's the number one thing we spend our money on. And I think for me, it was, appreciative of the time. Like the governor is the governor of the state of Missouri. I'm just the mayor of Columbia. Yes, it's the fourth largest city in Missouri, but at the same time, I'm appreciative of, I know the demands on the governor's time to spend time talking to constituents and stakeholders. For me, it was important that this was an opportunity for the police chief from the city of Columbia and the city manager and the mayor to be in front of the governor and talk about some of the data that we're seeing, the trends that we're seeing with crime in Columbia, some of the needs that we have, and where we could see state support coming from. The governor seemed like open, right? I think it was appreciative of that. I think the governor is also hearing from other stakeholders who, like we've talked about when we talk about perception and the different ways that you could interpret the data. And so it's just an opportunity for us to tell our interpretation of it, the information that we had, and look forward to continuing the conversations going forward.
Best case scenario, what would the governor do to help Columbia's crime situation?
Best case scenario would give us resources for things like a real-time crime data center. This is something that we could look at, when an incident happens, we could immediately have the data in front of us to work with that. City of Springfield, St. Louis, Kansas City all have those. In talking to some of my colleagues in Cleveland, Ohio, it's what helped them bring down most of their violent crime. I will say violent crime in Columbia is down 3.5%. The number one thing that I think actually the governor could do would be to, if you have a question about crime in Columbia, is to reach out to the police department and ask them what is it that they're hearing, what are the trends. The police chief yesterday in the meeting that we had brought up our legislative priority, that is that we have gun laws in the state of Missouri that mirror federal gun laws, where minor in possession of firearm is an offense. So right now, Missouri does not have that law. Ever since we got rid of concealed carry, the permits requirement, you now don't have an age requirement on when you're allowed to hold a firearm. And so what do they do with a 15-year-old who's walking around a parking lot? Do we enforce the federal law? Because the state law isn't there.
Did he give you any reaction to that? I've read that he did not, but I mean, did you ask for any reaction? Say, could you not support this under certain circumstances?
I don't know that the police chief asked for that directive, or just let them know that this was one of our priorities. For some of the things coming forward, these are some of the things that we've already been working with our representatives to have them bring to Jefferson City.
Along those same lines, I kind of have a two-parter for you, which
Mm.
is where was there consensus considering obviously you and the governor, very different politics, right? Democrat, Republican, very different roles, different constituencies, but I imagine you both want the best for Missourians. You have an overlap there. Where was the consensus?
Consensus was definitely on safe neighborhoods, like wanting safe neighborhoods, right? The consensus was on how do we support those who are the hardworking individuals who are in law enforcement? How can we make sure we talked a lot about recruitment and retention, the things that they're doing at the state level to help with like offsetting the cost of higher education for those in law enforcement and their dependents. Those are things that help us with recruitment and retention in the state of Missouri. So there's alignment around that. I think for us, it's also about this conversation around the data that's out there. And so for me, I think it was really useful for us to talk about how violent crime is down, crimes against property are down in Missouri or in Columbia. The things that are up against those crimes against society. And those are those things like a person with drug paraphernalia not having it, or possession of a firearm and they're not supposed to. Those are instances where the numbers are up. And it was an opportunity for us to explain the numbers are up because we have more law enforcement enforcing the law.
What did you say that St. Louis, Kansas City, Springfield has that we don't have that you could get through better state support? I don't understand.
So a real-time crime data center, right? So what this is
Why do they have it and we don't?
Part of it could be because of our size. Like they have, it's kind of usually a combined city county. And also for us, it would work really well if it were a regional approach, like Fulton, Ashland, Sturgeon. And that would help a lot if the state was then helping us with that through their public safety efforts, because then we can, because we're the largest one, right? In central Missouri, we're the largest, but it could be housed within Columbia Police Department, but then using their resources. One thing I'll point out, if you've noticed recent trends, the age is going down. Most likely with shooting victims and assailants, the age is going down. The other thing that you'll notice a trend is that not from Columbia.
Hmm.
And so this is, we're seeing people from Fulton, we're seeing people from Sturgeon, we're seeing some of these youth are coming in from outside of Columbia, and these activities and behaviors are happening in Columbia. If we had an opportunity to really have this regional approach, I think we could see some efforts to stave that from happening.
How long did the meeting last?
It was about 20, 25 minutes.
Is there going to be another one?
I said I was open to the conversation and Play will reach out to their chief of staff if I see another opportunity. I will say I haven't had a time yet today because I had a council meeting right after this meeting yesterday, but I haven't had a moment, but I want to send my kind of write up my thank you to the chief of staff for helping us organize this meeting and remind them the asks that we had.
Reports say that the meeting was asked for or something in early December, doesn't happen until almost a week into January. Was that just because of the holidays?
Yeah, because of timing. So how this happened was that, I, like so many others, saw a post on the governor's social media about a meeting with Moon Choi about crime in Columbia. I reached out to the governor's chief of staff and said, hey, I understand you're talking about crime in Columbia. I would love an opportunity for our police chief and city manager to also get in front of you and talk about, what sort of data they see and what sort of resources and needs they could see state support helping on. And so the chief of staff said, oh, I bet the governor would be very interested in that. And then it was just a matter of scheduling it.
Did you get an answer as to why you weren't invited to the Moon Choi meeting?
I did not. I believe I've had conflicting reports on who was organizing the meeting.
One more question for you. I read your year-end report
Oh,
here.
look at that. You're the one reader.
I'm the one person who read that report.
And printed
And
it
I
out,
printed
everybody.
it out, even in color.
Oh my gosh.
What department did you used to head here prior to being mayor?
Sustainability. Can I just tell you, I know you have like running out of time, but so even from my time as the sustainability manager, I would always give David such a hard time when I would come off on KFRU because he'd have like 10 newspapers in front of him, as well as printed off websites and website articles from different things. And I was just like, sustainability manager in me is dying.
I recycle.
There you go.
I had 4 bags of papers out today when the
Yeah.
garbage man came by.
Okay.
What I think about is always looking at the library and thinking about the
The
lights
lights
that
being
are on
on.
the reading room.
I know. I try to get them
That
to turn
drives
it
you
off.
crazy
It
too when
does.
you go by.
Yes. Okay, sorry. My end of year wrap up.
Well, I was just saying it's available online.
Yeah.
And I remember once you saying that people can get a lot of news if they go to the city website. And so
It is a very good
they can-
resource.
yeah.
Always a good idea. Well, before we wrap up, so this is usually where we would say, "Hey, dear listeners, we have some Q&A that we want to do from you all." But since this is our first episode, we don't have any questions from you listening, whoever you are. So please, we want this to be a civic dialogue. David and I do not want to operate in a silo with our co-hosts in these shows. We want audience questions, comments, concerns, whatever you're missing, all those things. So you can go to comovanguard.com. There's a link on there, takes you to a form you can submit, send us your questions, your comments, things like that. And then David and I will do our best moving forward to incorporate those into our discussions and things of that nature.
And we thank Mayor Barbara Buffaloe for being our very first official
Guinea
co-host
pig.
of
Guinea
the
pig.
Como Vanguard.
Yeah, so this has been the Como Vanguard podcast. If you found this episode useful, informative, whatever it might have been, please leave us a review on your podcast app of choice. We are brand new. We are trying to be informational, educational for folks who care about the city of Columbia, who care about making sure that people understand what's going on and why.
And don't forget to submit questions, as Nick has said a couple of times already. You can find the reporting, learn more about Como Vanguard, and submit questions at comovanguard.com.
Boop, boop, boop.